The Betty carrying Yamamoto crashed into the jungle approximately 10 miles northwest of Bougainville's Bouin airfield at approximately 9:43. The impact killed everyone aboard instantly. Japanese search parties would not reach the crash site until the following day, hacking through dense jungle growth to find the bomber's wreckage scattered across several hundred yards. Yamamoto's body was found still strapped in his seat, thrown clear of the main wreckage. Medical officers determined he had sustained 2 bullet wounds, one to the lower jaw and one to the left shoulder blade, either of which might have been fatal. The sword that had accompanied him on the inspection tour was recovered intact. Whether Yamamoto died from Barber's gunfire or from the crash impact remains debated, but the result was identical. Japan's greatest naval strategist was dead. The second Betty, carrying Yamamoto's chief of staff, Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, was also attacked. Multiple P-38s converged on it as it attempted to escape toward the ocean. Hit repeatedly, the bomber crashed into the water offshore. Unlike Yamamoto's aircraft, some personnel aboard this bomber survived the crash, including Ugaki, who was pulled from the water by Japanese rescue boats. The contrast in fates was stark. Yamamoto dead in the jungle, his chief of staff alive in the water. The Zero escorts engaged by Mitchell's larger formation were overwhelmed. 3 Zeros were shot down, while 1 P-38 was lost to enemy fire. Mitchell broke off the engagement as fuel states became critical, leading his formation south toward Guadalcanal. They had been over Bougainville for less than 6 minutes, but those 6 minutes changed the Pacific War's trajectory. Mitchell's formation struggled back to Guadalcanal running on vapors. Several P-38s landed with fuel gauges showing empty, engines sputtering as the last drops of gasoline fed into carburetors. The pilots climbed out exhausted, drained by 4.5 hours of high-stress flying and a brief but intense combat engagement. Intelligence officers immediately debriefed them, collecting combat reports before memories could fade or details could be contaminated by discussion among pilots. The debriefings focused obsessively on one question. Were the bomber crews certain both Betty bombers had been destroyed? The answer would determine whether Yamamoto was dead or merely failed to reach his destination. Until Japanese forces confirmed his death, the mission's success remained uncertain. Naval intelligence in Pearl Harbor and Washington faced an immediate crisis of operational security. Radio intercepts indicated that Japanese forces had begun searching for Yamamoto near Bougainville, suggesting his aircraft had not arrived as scheduled, but no confirmation of his death came immediately. The silence created intense anxiety among those who knew about the operation. If Yamamoto had survived, the mission had failed while simultaneously revealing to Japanese intelligence that American forces possessed long-range fighters and excellent intelligence about Japanese command movements. If he was dead, but the crash site remained undiscovered, the strategic benefit was diminished because Japan's military leadership might not immediately recognize the loss. The mission's success required Yamamoto to be dead and his death to be confirmed by Japanese authorities, triggering the morale and leadership impacts American planners anticipated. Japanese search parties found Yamamoto's crash site on April 19th, confirming his death. The news reached Tokyo on April 20th, creating shock and grief throughout Japan's military and civilian leadership. Admiral Yamamoto's death represented an incalculable loss. No other Japanese naval officer commanded equivalent respect or possessed comparable strategic vision. His replacement, Admiral Minichi Koga, was competent but uninspiring, lacking Yamamoto's aggressive creativity and ability to inspire subordinates. Japanese naval operations after April 1943 would become progressively more defensive and reactive, though multiple factors beyond Yamamoto's death contributed to this shift. American intelligence analysts, studying Japanese naval communications after the ambush, noted reduced operational tempo and more cautious decision-making patterns consistent with leadership disruption. The most critical aspect of the operation, however, was maintaining absolute secrecy about how American forces knew Yamamoto's location. If Japan suspected that their naval codes were compromised, they would change them immediately, blinding American intelligence at a critical phase of the Pacific War. The official story, carefully constructed by American intelligence officials, attributed the interception to Coastwatcher reports and routine long-ran patrol activities. Mitchell's pilots were explicitly ordered never to discuss the mission's true origins or suggest that intelligence predicted Yamamoto's flight. This cover story required Japanese authorities to believe the ambush was either extraordinarily lucky or based on routine surveillance rather than cryptanalysis. The plausibility of this cover story depended on Japan not recognizing how improbable the interception actually was. Japanese intelligence officers investigated the circumstances surrounding Yamamoto's death extensively. They questioned whether communication security had been breached, whether the admiral's schedule had been leaked, and whether American forces possessed intelligence capabilities more sophisticated than previously assessed. According to declassified American intelligence reports analyzing Japanese communications after the ambush, the SAC investigations concluded that the interception resulted from bad luck rather than compromised codes. Japanese authorities noted that Yamamoto's flight had taken him over waters where American patrol aircraft occasionally operated, and that the timing could have been coincidental. This conclusion, though incorrect, was precisely what American cryptanalysts needed Japan to believe. The JN-25 code remained in use, continuing to provide American forces with strategic intelligence throughout 1943 and into 1944. The assassination of Admiral Yamamoto demonstrated both the power and the peril of signals intelligence in modern warfare. American codebreakers had achieved what many considered impossible, breaking a major military cipher and reading enemy communications in near real time. This capability provided strategic advantages that arguably shortened the Pacific War by months or years, saving countless lives. Yet exploiting this intelligence always carried risk. Every operation based on decrypted intelligence might expose the capability, prompting code changes that would eliminate the advantage. The Yamamoto operation represented the maximum acceptable risk, targeting an individual whose death was deemed worth potentially compromising the entire code-breaking program. That Japanese investigators failed to recognize the compromise validated the decision, but did not eliminate the risk. The unauthorized telephone call that initiated the operation remained a footnote in classified files for decades. Official histories of the Yamamoto assassination focused on the tactical execution, the navigation challenges, and the combat engagement while carefully obscuring the intelligence sources that made it possible. Not until 1977, when the National Security Agency declassified significant portions of American code-breaking efforts during World War II, did the public learn how thoroughly American cryptanalysts had penetrated Japanese communications. Even then, specific details about individual operations remained classified. The identity of the engineer or intelligence officer who made that first unauthorized call may never be definitively established, buried in records too sensitive to release even decades after the events. Admiral Nimitz personally approved commendations for Mitchell and his pilots, though the citations were carefully worded to avoid mentioning Yamamoto by name or suggesting the mission had specific intelligence behind it. Major Mitchell received the Navy Cross, as did Captains Lanfear and Barber, though disputes about who actually shot down Yamamoto's bomber would poison relationships between Lanfear and Barber for the rest of their lives. These disputes, while bitter and personal, were also strategic. Whoever shot down Yamamoto became the man who avenged Pearl Harbor, a distinction carrying enormous symbolic weight in American culture. Post-war investigations concluded that Barber's fire struck Yamamoto's bomber, but Lanfear maintained until his death that he delivered the fatal attack. The truth likely involved both pilots contributing to the bomber's destruction in a confused engagement lasting less than 2 minutes. Yamamoto's death marked a turning point in the Pacific War, though perhaps less dramatic than American planners hoped. Japan's military continued fighting with undiminished ferocity for more than 2 years after the admiral's death. The island-hopping campaigns, the naval battles, the strategic bombing, and ultimately the atomic weapons that ended the war, all occurred after Yamamoto was gone. His replacement as Combined Fleet Commander, Admiral Ko-Ae, proved adequate if uninspiring, maintaining Japanese resistance until his own death in a plane crash in March 1944. The war's outcome was determined by industrial capacity, resource availability, and strategic geography more than individual leadership. Yet Yamamoto's absence was felt. Japanese naval operations after April 1943 lacked the aggressive creativity that characterized earlier campaigns. The decisive battle that Japanese doctrine sought never materialized, partly because no commander possessed Yamamoto's willingness to stake everything on a single engagement. The ethical dimensions of the operation troubled some participants even decades later. Targeted assassination of enemy leaders, while militarily effective, raised questions about the laws of war and the precedents being established. If American forces could ambush Yamamoto based on intercepted communications, what prevented enemies from doing the same to American leaders? The operation existed in a moral gray zone, where military necessity justified actions that, peacetime ethics might condemn. President Roosevelt's authorization provided political cover, but individual participants still wrestled with the distinction between combat and murder. These concerns, largely suppressed during wartime, surfaced in post-war interviews and memoirs as veterans reflected on their roles in what was, functionally, an assassination carried out with military precision. The technological and intelligence infrastructure that enabled the Yamamoto assassination became the foundation for modern signals intelligence operations. The code-breaking capabilities developed during World War II evolved into the National Security Agency, established in 1952 to coordinate American cryptanalysis and communication security. The lessons learned from operations like the Yamamoto ambush, about balancing intelligence exploitation against source protection, remained fundamental to intelligence practice throughout the Cold War and into the modern era. Every signals intelligence operation today faces the same essential trade-off: using the intelligence risks, losing the capability to collect it. The engineers and cryptanalysts who broke JN-25 established methodologies and tradecraft that persist in modern intelligence services. The unauthorized telephone call that initiated the operation, that breach of security protocol, motivated by recognition that opportunity was fleeting, represented a human decision embedded in bureaucratic systems designed to minimize individual judgment. Whoever made that call understood that by the time proper protocols were followed and appropriate, April 18, 1943, dawned gray and heavy over the Solomon Islands, but in a cramped radio intercept station thousands of miles away at Pearl Harbor, Navy cryptanalyst Lieutenant Commander Alva Laswell stared at a decoded message that would alter the course of the Pacific War. The decrypt, pulled from Japanese naval transmissions just hours earlier, contained 18 routine words that carried extraordinary weight. Admiral Isoroku Y. Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor's devastation, would be flying to Bougainville the following morning on an inspection tour. His exact departure time, flight path, and arrival schedule lay naked before American eyes, a gift wrapped in enemy hubris. Laswell's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the secure telephone, knowing the intelligence was genuine because American codebreakers had, for nearly 2 years, been reading Japan's most secret naval communications through a program so classified that its very existence could never be acknowledged in polite company. The breakthrough had come much earlier, in the months before Pearl Harbor, when Antoine Douay of brilliant cryptanalysts at Station Haipo in Hawaii had begun peeling back the layers of JN-25, the Japanese Navy's primary operational code. Leading this effort was Commander Joseph Rochefort, a man whose genius for pattern recognition bordered on supernatural. Working in the basement of the Pearl Harbor Administration Building, Rochefort and his team had labored through thousands of intercepted messages, building vast card catalogs of code groups, identifying patterns in the encrypted traffic, and gradually reconstructing the C-ite complex substitution cipher that protected Japan's naval secrets. Their work existed in a shadow world where traditional legal frameworks bent under the weight of wartime necessity. The very act of intercepting and decoding foreign military communications occupied a gray zone in international law, something American officials preferred not to discuss publicly. Yet this morally ambiguous endeavor had already proven its worth at the Battle of Midway in June 1942, when Rochefort's team had provided Admiral Chester Nimitz with precise intelligence about Japanese fleet movements, enabling a victory that shifted the Pacific War's momentum. Now, 10 months after Midway, that same intelligence apparatus had delivered something even more valuable: the location of the man who had orchestrated the surprise attack that killed 2,400 Americans and dragged the United States into global war. According to the decrypt, Yamamoto would depart Rabaul at 600 hours on April 18th, aboard a Mitsubishi G4M bomber, escorted by 60 fighters, bound for Balale Airfield near Bougainville. The flight would last approximately 3 hours, keeping him over predictable ocean routes. Laswell knew immediately what this meant. Yamamoto, considered irreplaceable by the Japanese high command, would be vulnerable during those 3 hours, flying in a slow, lightly armed transport within range of American fighters. The temptation to strike was overwhelming, but executing such an operation presented extraordinary challenges, both tactical and ethical. The intelligence had to climb the chain of command rapidly, reaching Admiral Nimitz and ultimately Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox and President Franklin Roosevelt himself. But before that ascent could begin, Mayona had to make an unauthorized call that would set everything in motion, a communication that technically violated security protocols designed to protect the code-breaking operation's secrecy. That call would come from an engineer whose name remains disputed by historians. A man working within the intelligence apparatus who understood that sometimes rules existed to be broken when the stakes justified the risk. The secure telephone line connecting Pearl Harbor to Washington ran through multiple relay stations, each representing a potential security breach that could compromise the entire code-breaking operation. Communications protocol demanded that sensitive intelligence move through official channels with proper documentation and coded language that obscured specific details. Direct phone calls discussing operational intelligence were strictly forbidden, particularly when they involved information derived from signals intelligence. The Japanese military, though confident in their code's security, constantly monitored for evidence that their communications were being read. Any operational decision that seemed impossibly prescient could prompt a wholesale code change, instantly blinding American intelligence and potentially costing thousands of lives. This tension between using intelligence and protecting its source created a perpetual dilemma for those who intercepted enemy secrets. Commander Rochefort understood these constraints intimately. His basement operation at Station Hypo existed under constant pressure to deliver actionable intelligence while maintaining absolute secrecy about capabilities and methods. The Midway victory had already pushed the boundaries of acceptable risk. Japanese intelligence officers had questioned how American carriers arrived at precisely the right location to ambush their fleet, but fortunately attributed it to reconnaissance aircraft rather than compromised communications. A second seemingly miraculous ambush targeting Yamamoto personally might not be so easily explained. If the Japanese suspected their primary naval code was broken, they would change it immediately, and American codebreakers would face months or years of work to break the new system. The Pacific War could stagnate or tilt back toward Japan as American forces lost their strategic vision into enemy intentions. Yet the opportunity was unprecedented. Yamamoto represented more than just another military target. He embodied Japanese naval aviation, having conceived and championed the carrier-based attack doctrine that devastated Pearl Harbor. His strategic vision and aggressive leadership had shaped Japan's early war successes across the Pacific. American intelligence assessments consistently identified him as uniquely dangerous, a military mind whose loss would signify significantly impact Japanese naval operations. Beyond strategy, Yamamoto's death would deliver a profound psychological blow to Japanese morale while galvanizing American determination. The propaganda value alone justified considerable risk. According to accounts preserved in National Archives records documenting the operation's planning phase, naval intelligence officers debated the trade-off intensely during the hours after the decrypt was confirmed. The decision ultimately required political authority beyond military command. Admiral Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, would need to approve any operation, but assassination of a specific military leader by ambush raised questions that touched the highest levels of government. Secretary Knox and President Roosevelt would have to sign off on what amounted to a targeted killing based on intelligence capabilities whose existence remained classified. The communication burden fell to naval intelligence officers in Hawaii, who needed to alert Washington immediately while the window of opportunity remained open. Time zones worked against them. Hawaii lay multiple hours behind Washington, and the Easter Sunday morning when the decrypt arrived found many senior officials away from their desks. Standard communication protocols, involving encrypted telegrams and coded dispatches, would take hours to compose, transmit, decrypt, and deliver. Someone decided to pick up the telephone. Historical records do not definitively identify who made the initial unauthorized call, though several engineers and intelligence officers working at Station Hypo have been credited by various accounts. What remains clear is that someone bypassed established protocols, risking court-martial and compromising operational security to ensure that DCCE decision-makers in Washington learned about Yamamoto's travel plans while enough time remained to mount an interception. That call represented a calculated gamble that the opportunity justified the security risk, a bet that would play out over the next 24 hours as the machinery of American military power ground into motion. The unauthorized telephone call reached Washington during the afternoon of April 17th, creating immediate chaos within the Navy Department's corridors. Captain John Redman, head of Naval Communications Intelligence in Washington, took the call from Hawaii with growing alarm. The voice on the other end, crackling through the transcontinental connection, violated every security protocol Redman had established for handling signals intelligence. SPI. Aching in only thinly veiled language, the caller conveyed that the Japanese admiral responsible for Pearl Harbor would be flying a specific route at a specific time the following day, and that American forces could intercept him. Redman's first instinct was fury at the breach of communication security, but his second was recognition of the extraordinary opportunity being described. Within minutes, Redman was climbing the stairs to Admiral Ernest King's office. King, serving as both Chief of Naval Operations and Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, wielded immense power over American naval strategy. Known for his abrasive personality and demanding standards, King had little patience for officers who wasted his time, but Redman knew this intel. Legence would capture his attention immediately. The meeting lasted less than 10 minutes. King grasped the implications instantly and made the critical decision that would define the operation. They would brief Secretary Knox and seek presidential approval for the mission. No admiral would order the assassination of an enemy commander of Yamamoto's stature without explicit civilian authorization. The political and diplomatic ramifications, if the operation failed or was exposed, required the commander-in-chief's personal approval. Secretary Knox, informed that evening at his home, immediately telephoned President Roosevelt. The president, despite his declining health and the enormous burdens of managing a global war on two fronts, recognized the opportunity's significance. Roosevelt had taken Pearl Harbor's devastation personally, viewing the surprise attack as a profound betrayal despite the diplomatic tensions that preceded it. Yamamoto, as Pearl Harbor's architect, represented unfinished business. According to accounts compiled by historian Carol Glines in his extensively researched book, Attack on Yamamoto, Roosevelt's authorization came in characteristically direct language. Get Yamamoto. 3 words that condemned Japan's greatest naval strategist to death. The authorization returned down the chain of command with equal speed. King contacted Nimitz in Pearl Harbor early on April 17 Hawaiian time, conveying presidential approval for an interception mission. Nimitz now faced the tactical challenge of executing an ambush approximately 400 nautical miles from American-controlled airfields, deep in territory dominated by Japanese air power. Only one aircraft in the American inventory possessed the range and performance to reach Yamamoto's flight path and return safely, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. This twin-engine, twin-boom fighter had the range to cover the 800-mile round trip, the speed to intercept Japanese bombers, and the firepower to destroy them quickly. Nimitz contacted Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding air operations in the Solomon Islands, with orders to prepare an interception mission using P-38 fighters based at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. Mitcher received the coded orders with professional calm that masked inner turmoil. He commanded 13th Air Force operations in a theater where every aircraft and pilot was precious. The Japanese still contested control of the Solomon Islands with daily air raids and naval bombardments. Committing his longest-range fighters to a deep penetration mission meant stripping air defense coverage from vulnerable positions. If the mission failed, or Japanese forces launched a major attack while his P-38s were away, the consequences could be severe. Moreover, the mission required absolute secrecy, even from most of his own staff. Too many people knowing about the operation increased the risk that Japanese intelligence might learn of the trap. Mitchell briefed only his operations officer, Commander William Morrison, about the target's identity. They would prepare the mission under the guise of a routine long-range interception of Japanese transport aircraft. Major John Mitchell of the 339th Fighter Squadron received his mission briefing late on April 17th, less than 12 hours before the scheduled interception. Mitchell, a veteran pilot with methodical attention to detail, listened as operations officers outlined an intercept mission, unlike anything previously attempted in the Pacific theater. Intelligence indicated that 2 Japanese bombers escorted by 6 fighters would be flying from Rabaul to Bougainville the following morning, following a specific route over water. Mitchell's flight of 18 P-38 Lightnings would fly a precisely calculated course, covering 435 miles to arrive at the interception point exactly as the Japanese flight passed. The margin for error was essentially zero. Arriving even 5 minutes early or late would result in missing the target entirely. What the briefing officers did not initially reveal was the identity of the passenger aboard one of those bombers. Mitchell and his pilots knew only that this was a high-priority target whose destruction justified the extraordinary effort and risk. The engineering challenge alone was daunting. P-38 fighters normally carried enough fuel for approximately 4 hours of flight at cruise speed. This mission would require at least 4.5 hours of flying time, pushing the aircraft to their absolute range limits. Any combat maneuvering, any navigation errors requiring course corrections, any headwinds stronger than forecast would leave pilots unable to reach home. They would be forced to ditch in shark-infested waters hundreds of miles from rescue. Mitchell requested external fuel tanks to extend range, but Henderson Field's supply was limited. Maintenance crews worked through the night installing long-range tanks on the aircraft designated for the mission. Navigation presented an even greater challenge. The interception point lay 435 miles northwest of Guadalcanal, entirely over open ocean with no landmarks for reference. Radio navigation aids were primitive by later standards, and maintaining radio silence was essential to avoid alerting Japanese forces. Mitchell would need to navigate by dead reckoning, calculating headings and airspeeds to arrive at a specific point in the sky at a specific time. A nigh error in compass heading, any miscalculation of wind speed or direction, would cause the formation to miss the intercept. Making the challenge even more difficult, the flight path had to avoid Japanese radar installations on various islands while staying far enough from land to prevent visual detection by coast watchers. The route resembled a complex geometry problem with human lives as the penalty for incorrect solutions. Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber, selected for the actual attack element, represented the mission's sharp edge. Mitchell would lead the entire 18-aircraft formation, but only 4 P-38s would climb to engage the Japanese bombers directly. The remaining 14 would fly cover, protecting against the Zero fighter escort and any other Japanese aircraft that might intervene. Lanphier and Barber, both experienced combat pilots with confirmed kills against Japanese aircraft, would lead the attack element with 2 wingmen. Their briefing included specific instructions about target priority. Intelligence indicated 2 bombers would be flying in loose formation. Both were to be destroyed if possible, but if circumstances forced a choice, the lead bomber was the primary target. Only then did mission planners reveal why. Admiral Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, would be aboard the lead aircraft. The revelation transformed the mission from a routine interception into something far more significant. These pilots, many of whom had friends killed at Pearl Harbor or in the desperate early months of the Pacific War, would strike directly at the man responsible for initiating the conflict. The psychological impact on the pilots was immediate and profound. According to memoirs and interviews preserved in the National Museum of the Pacific War's Oral History Collection, SC, several pilots described feeling the weight of history settling on their shoulders. They were about to participate in an assassination, though military terminology carefully avoided that word, preferring interception of enemy military leadership. The distinction was largely semantic. They were flying more than 400 miles to kill one specific man whose death would serve both military and political objectives. Dawn on April 18, 1943, broke clear and warm over Guadalcanal, offering perfect weather for long-range navigation. Mitchell's 18 P-38 pilots gathered for final briefing at 500 hours, going over navigation calculations one last time. The flight plan represented a masterpiece of engineering precision. Mitchell had plotted a course that would take them northwest from Henderson Field, passing between Japanese-held islands while staying far enough offshore to avoid radar detection. The route then curved north toward Bougainville, timing the arrival to intersect Yamamoto's southbound flight path at exactly 9:35 local time. Every minute of the flight was calculated. Takeoff at 7:20, reaching the interception point at 9:35, allowing a 5-minute window for combat, then returning to Guadalcanal with minimal fuel reserves. The engineering behind the P-38 Lightning made the mission possible. Designed by Lockheed's legendary engineer Clarence Kelly Johnson, the Lightning represented an unconventional approach to fighter design. Its twin Allison engines, mounted in twin booms extending back from the wings, gave it redundancy that single-engine fighters lacked. Losing one engine meant reduced performance, but not an automatic death sentence. The sentry, nacelle housing the pilot, sat between the booms, positioning the cockpit ahead of the wings for excellent visibility. Most importantly, the twin-engine configuration provided the range necessary for deep penetration missions. With external fuel tanks, the Lightning could reach targets far beyond the capability of more conventional fighters like the P-40 Warhawk or F-4F Wildcat. At 7:20 precisely, Mitchell's formation began taking off from Henderson Field's steel matting runway. The heavily loaded fighters, carrying external fuel tanks and full ammunition loads, struggled into the morning air one by one. Mitchell led them into a wide orbit over Guadalcanal, while stragglers joined up, then turned northwest and descended to wavetop height. Fly E. Nung Lo reduced the risk of radar detection and visual observation from Japanese coast watchers, but it increased fuel consumption and made navigation more difficult. Without altitude, pilots couldn't use celestial navigation or see distant landmarks. They were committed to Mitchell's dead reckoning calculations. If he was wrong about wind speed, wind direction, or compass variation, they would all miss the intercept and waste a mission that had originated in the Oval Office. 2 hours into the flight, the formation was over open ocean with no land in sight. Several pilots grew anxious about fuel consumption, watching their gauges slowly decline as engines drank the precious gasoline that represented their only means of returning home. One P-38 developed mechanical problems and turned back, reducing the formation to 17 aircraft. The remaining pilots pressed on, trusting Mitchell's navigation. At 9:20, Mitchell began a gradual turn north, bringing the formation onto the final intercept heading. The tension in each cockpit was palpable. They were now approximately 30 miles south of Bougainville, deep in Japanese-controlled airspace. If Mitchell's calculations were correct, they would see Yamamoto's flight in approximately 15 minutes. If he was wrong, they would see nothing but empty sky, and the fuel gauges would be showing critically low levels with a 400-mile flight home. At 9:34, Lieutenant Doug Canning, flying as Mitchell's wingman, spotted aircraft at 1 o'clock high. 2 Betty bombers, painted dark green, were descending toward Bougainville with 6-0 fighters flying loose escort. The formation was exactly where intelligence had predicted it would. Old B, arriving within 1 minute of the forecasted time. Mitchell's navigation had been perfect. The mission was now a matter of execution. Mitchell radioed the attack element. "Skin 'em off, Tom, go get 'em." Lanfear and Barber, with their 2 wingmen, broke away from the main formation and climbed toward the Japanese bombers, while Mitchell led the remaining 14 P-38s upward to engage the 0 escorts. The ambush had been sprung. The Japanese formation flew in relaxed confidence, unaware that they had been tracked across 500 miles of ocean by American intelligence and intercepted by fighters whose presence this far from Guadalcanal should have been impossible. Aboard the lead bomber, Admiral Yamamoto sat in the passenger compartment, reviewing inspection notes for his visit to Forward B, ACES. The admiral, known for his punctuality, had insisted on precise departure and arrival times, a commitment to schedule that had made him predictable. That predictability, combined with his staff's insistence on radio communication detailing his travel plans, had created the vulnerability American codebreakers exploited. Yamamoto understood radio security in theory, but never imagined that American cryptanalysts had achieved such complete penetration of Japanese naval communications. Captain Lanfear and Lieutenant Barber accelerated their P-38s, climbing toward the Japanese bombers, while 6 Zeros above began diving to intercept. The next few minutes would decide whether the mission succeeded or failed catastrophically. Lanfear, slightly ahead of Barber, found himself engaged by multiple Zeros diving to cut him off from the bombers. He turned to T.O. meet them, sacrificing his attack run to draw the escorts away from Barber. This critical decision, later disputed in historical accounts about who actually shot down Yamamoto's bomber, allowed Barber a clear approach to the lead Betty. With Zeros fixated on Lanfear's threatening presence, Barber closed on the bomber from below and behind, positioning for a stern attack. Barber opened fire at approximately 200 yards, walking his tracer rounds into the Betty's right engine and fuselage. The Mitsubishi G4M bomber, known to Allied pilots as Betty, had a fatal design flaw that earned it the grim nickname, the Flying Lighter. Fuel tanks located in the wings lacked adequate protection and self-sealing capabilities, making the aircraft vulnerable to catching fire when hit. Barber's 20mm cannon shells and 50 caliber machine gun rounds tore through the bomber's right wing and engine. Almost immediately, smoke began streaming from the damaged engine. The Betty pulled up sharply, then rolled left in an apparent attempt to make an emergency landing in the jungle below. According to Barber's combat report, filed immediately after the mission and preserved in Air Force historical archives, he fired several more bursts as the bomber descended, seeing debris fly from the fuselage. Authorities consulted. The window for action might close. They chose to act, accepting personal risk to enable a mission whose strategic value seemed self-evident. This pattern, the individual who sees clearly and acts decisively despite rules and procedures, appears throughout history at critical moments. Sometimes such decisions lead to catastrophe. Sometimes they enable outcomes impossible through rigid adherence to protocol. The Yamamoto operation succeeded partly because someone was willing to pick up a telephone and speak words that should not have been spoken, trusting that the people on the other end would recognize the opportunity and act appropriately. That trust was vindicated by Mitchell's navigation, Barber's gunnery, and Japanese investigators' failure to recognize how completely their communications were compromised. One engineer's illegal phone call, combined with code-breaking brilliance, tactical execution, and strategic insight, allowed America to ambush the architect of Pearl Harbor, extracting a measure of revenge while shortening a brutal war. The operation's legacy endures in the intelligence services, military tactics, and ethical debates that continue to shape how democracies wage war in an age where information itself has become a weapon as powerful as any bomb or bullet.